Greetings once again from Cooperstown, New York, side of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. We thank you for joining us today. For those who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work in the education department here at the Hall of Fame. My objective over the next hour will be to speak as little as possible because I'm going to be asking the expert to provide lots of information today. And our expert today from our staff is Hall of Fame Senior Curator Tom Schieber. Tom, a longtime employee of the Hall of Fame. Some of our viewers may know Tom through their membership in SABR, Society for American Baseball Research. Actually, we're all, as Hall of Fame employees, we're all technically members of SABR, but Tom is particularly active in the group, has won some awards as well. So we're very glad to have Tom with us today. Our program is kind of a basic one, but it's an instrumental one to any museum, and it's the process of creating an exhibit. We're going to talk about exactly what exhibits are, how they are different from displays. We're going to talk about what's involved in the early process, the brainstorming, the securing of funding, lots of developing concepts. All of that will be covered over the next hour. Very glad to have with us Senior Curator for the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, Tom Schieber. Tom, welcome to the program. How you doing?
Good, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
So let's begin very basically. The word exhibits. Maybe a lot of people think they know what an exhibit is. Maybe I think I know what an exhibit is, but I'm not a curator, so I'm not 100% in tune to this. You are. There is a difference between an exhibit, which is what we, for the most part, feature at the museum today, versus a display. And if we have long ago visitors, maybe if people had been here back in the 1980s, many of our presentations were actually more displays than exhibits. So that has changed over the last 40 years. But if you will, Tom, give us a definition, exhibit versus display. What exactly is the difference?
So we talk about displays and interpretive exhibits, and what we do as curators is we tell stories. I mean, that's what it boils down to is storytelling. The stories all have something to do with baseball, but we're no different than a novelist who tells stories by putting words in print on paper, or a filmmaker who has moving images on film, celluloid, whatever the case may be. They're all telling stories. They have special methods to do that. We have our method, and that is creating interpretive exhibits. Now, the difference you're alluding to is that a display basically is simply a way of showing objects with minimal identifiers of this is what this object is. But an interpretive exhibit is something that actually tells a story. It uses objects and labels and whatever else we can get our hands on to weave a story. So the example that I've come up with is let's say that we had the following objects in a case with some identifying labels. Maybe some old discolored baseballs from the late 1910s, and a baseball card of Yankees pitcher Carl Mays, let's say, and a jersey of Ray Chapman of the Indians, and a scorecard, let's say, of an Indians-Yankees game from August 16, 1920, and a newspaper headline from a couple days later that says, "Death of Ray Chapman, great shock to baseball fans." Okay, these are all different objects that help tell you about an event that occurred having its 100th anniversary in just a few days, the tragic death of Ray Chapman, who was hit by a pitch on field of play. The anniversary is this Sunday coming up, 100th anniversary. Well, what we've done here is we've given you these objects, but we haven't given you a story of why it happened or the ramifications of it happening, how it changed the game. We've lost this very rich, engaging opportunity. So in order to make it a coherent story, we have to plan it out. We have to use the objects to help further that story, relate them to what happened prior, what happened around the time of the event, what happened days and years afterwards. I mean, in a sense, I'd say an interpretive exhibit tells a story, but a display will just show you the main characters. Hopefully that gives you a feel for for where we're going. So, sometimes the display is a nice, useful thing, but it's always a richer experience if there's a good storyline and we can make it an interpretive exhibit.
So Tom, is this way to think of it? A display, you maybe have a smattering of artifacts, and they have a connection to each other, but you don't really explain the connection. Whereas an exhibit, there's a definite theme, an overall theme that you're trying to present to whoever it is who's viewing it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, sometimes there's a couple themes, but you've really nailed it. We're trying to do something special and bring these together and use these objects to help further that story and to reinforce the story and the themes, like you're saying. Yes.
Let's talk about the ideas for exhibits, and these can come from many different places. There are way more ideas than any museum can do because there are limitations in terms of space and funding and other things as well. But let's talk about where some of these ideas come from. They're not all just from you and the other curators. They come from outside areas as well. Tell us about that.
Sure. So you're right. So we're always thinking about good ideas for exhibits. Sometimes we think of bad ideas for exhibits, and those get nixed pretty quick. But they come from staff members. They come from fans who have an idea. They come from collectors. They come from people in baseball. So we listen to all of these ideas. Some of the ideas have been in the hopper for a long time, many, many, many years. Other ideas may pop up on the fly. Something happened and you go, you know what? Maybe this is an exhibit because it gained attention recently. But you're right, we can't do every exhibit that's pitched to us or pitched by us. Some of them are simply not going to work for various reasons, and oftentimes that's the easiest part is calling out the ones that for whatever reason won't work for us. But we're still left with a really big list and a growing list of good ideas, and the real tricky part is prioritizing those ideas. Which ones are going to work? Which ones are going to be fundable? Which ones are feasible, really, given the constraints of time and money and staff and space and all of those difficult constraints, which we don't have a lot of. So in short, it's the moral is just because we're not moving forward with an exhibit idea doesn't necessarily mean it isn't a good idea. It's just there's lots of good ideas and we can't do them all.
One example that comes to mind in terms of the length of this process, I first started here back in 1995, and we had I think we could call it a display of baseball cards. Mm-hmm. There wasn't really a theme, there wasn't really a story being told, but it did show a lot of baseball cards. It was colorful, people enjoyed it. There was some talk about maybe doing a themed exhibit. So this was 1995 when I started here, and we'd had that baseball card display up for a number of years. Yeah. We didn't actually put together a themed baseball card exhibit until last year, 2019.
Right.
So it can take a while.
It can, and I know that's a bummer for visitors who are looking, and actually for a while, there was no baseball card exhibit. There was no display. There was nothing for a number of years because we had to take the display down because something else moved in there. And so we knew we're going to redo this. Obviously, we're going to do a baseball card exhibit. But yeah, it didn't get finished until last year. And so there was a lot of people who were saying, hey, where's the exhibit? And we were just as bummed about there not being an exhibit as well. But there was various priorities we had to, it's kind of a triage situation. Which things are we going to do now and which things are we going to do later? And we finally got around to it. And it's wonderful. It's a great exhibit. And we've gotten a lot of good buzz about it. And but sometimes these things take a long time to get to the point where they say, yes, move forward. And then, of course, once that happens, it takes a while to actually do this entire process we're going to talk about in these, I guess, next 2 episodes of Ask an Expert. This is the first part, but there'll be a second part where we'll get to some more of the story of how we put together an exhibit. Just
to use the baseball card exhibit a little further, that exhibit actually goes back to the 1980s. And that was the first time I came here. I was in college. It was 1987. And the museum was much smaller back then than it is now. We, I think, would go through 2 more major expansions since 87. there wasn't really room to do a themed baseball card exhibit. You just didn't have the physical space. One of the things that enabled this exhibit to happen was actually the expansion of the museum. So that can be another factor too.
That's right. And actually we'll talk about, and remind me, because I'll forget otherwise, but remind me, and we'll talk about how one of the things that informed us about how we're going to do this exhibit and was where we're going to do the exhibit. And we'll talk about that in a little while. But the location, specifically the baseball card exhibit location, was really critical. So when we get to talking about locations of exhibits, just give me a nudge, interrupt me, and I'll say, oh yeah, let me tell you about the baseball card story.
By the way, the exhibit that we now have on baseball cards is called Shoebox Treasures. It's up on the 3rd floor. Beautifully done, lots of great stories, very colorfully presented. So if you're thinking about coming out here and you like baseball cards, definitely check out Shoebox Treasures. You mentioned some of the ideas that don't necessarily work, even though in theory it's a good concept. Have there ever been, since you've been here, has there ever been an exhibit idea that maybe the staff started to go ahead with, and then we realized we just can't do it for some reason? Has that happened?
That has happened, and sometimes we start one and then we stop, but we haven't given up on it. We're just saying, you know what, we need to move on to something else right now, and it's not a waste of time. We can pick up where we left off. And other times, no, we're just moving straight ahead, and there's no gaps at all. It just goes smoothly, and you just have to be able to listen. This is nothing particular to museum life. It's a lesson of life in general. You got to be flexible and ready to turn on a dime, because things are going to come up, and the less flexible you are, the more you're going to suffer from not being able to make these changes. Having said that, and we'll talk about this in a little while, it is critical to make sure you do have a plan, that you have it mapped out. If you don't have something mapped out, you're never going to get anywhere. But sometimes when your plans do have to change.
All right, let's talk about this planning process. Let's say the curatorial team has 3 or 4 different ideas for a possible exhibit. You then all sit down, you talk about the pros and cons of each one. Do you then just try to boil it down to one and go from there, or does it work differently?
It's a little bit different than that, actually. So what we're doing when we are coming up with an exhibit plan, it's not for one exhibit, it's for multiple exhibits. So we don't do things in serial, we do them in parallel, and there's offset a little bit. But there can be multiple things going on at once. And we have a big old crazy, it's not really a spreadsheet, it's kind of like a spreadsheet, where there's a number of different years, and we pretty much look 10 years out. So we're looking at what's happening next year, and we're looking at what's happening in 2, 4, 6, 10 years. And we've got things mapped out. Now we understand that the 10-year is, if we actually nail that perfectly, that's probably pretty impressive. We understand that things can change out there. But if we don't make a plan at all, then we're going to be just making it up as we go along. The things that are happening next year, that's pretty locked in. It's very difficult to change on the fly on that. So there's a lot of different ideas and a lot of different exhibits that are on the books. This is the direction we're going to go. And obviously the ones that are happening sooner are more developed than the ones that are more out there. So we're doing a lot of them at once, and we think of it as short-term and long-term planning. And for each one, we're thinking about, how long is it going to take to do the exhibit, what the size and location of the exhibit might be, some general concepts for it. Very, very early on, we don't want to get down to the deep, hardcore details. That's not a good use of time, because that's going to happen later. Only when it's been okayed to do the exhibit. We can get into the weeds, and if it doesn't get okayed, that was a waste of time, right? So basically, we kind of think of there's 2 main kinds of exhibits. There's sort of permanent exhibits and temporary exhibits. And a permanent exhibit we think of as generally lasting about 20 years. So the word permanent's a little bit misleading, but after about 20 years, any topic that you're covering probably needs to be revisited. And any exhibit's going to start to look a little old, look a little dated. We may have new artifacts, new stories, new research to come along, better understanding, a new understanding. So, you know, the permanent exhibit's maybe going to last around 20 years. Sometimes it's only 15, sometimes it's 25. And then temporary exhibits are really looking more short term. Maybe that exhibit's going to only last a year or maybe 2. And as you might guess, those are smaller and they tend to take less time to put together. But for each exhibit, we're thinking about when are we going to start the process? When is it going to end? Like I said, what size is it going to be? What are the available resources we have, whether it's staff or timing? So we come up with this multi-year schedule and take into account all these different factors as best as we can to try to present to senior staff for their, okay, yes, you guys are going in the right direction. Let's do this. Let's not do that.
Once you've decided, okay, we're definitely going to do this exhibit, and it's the next one coming up on our list, how much time do you need? A year, year and a half, 2 years, longer? What's the time frame?
So, and everything we're going to talk about today is sort of generalizations, because each exhibit has its own little path that deviates from the planned path. But I'm just going to talk in generalizations. Generally, a permanent exhibit is going to take, that's of normal size, is going to take close to 2 years. From the moment we get the yes, okay, move forward, all the way to the ribbon cutting celebration of the opening of the exhibit. And we'll talk about all that happens in between those 2 points, as well a little bit before and a little bit after those points. A temporary exhibit can, as I mentioned, can actually happen a little bit quicker. Because it's not as big, it's not as involved, it's generally not going to have a heavy load of, let's say, lots of technology, or necessarily a lot of casework that has to be built, specially built cases or new walls, or so those might take closer to a year, maybe 9 to 12 months, but it's very tough to do something in under a year. It really is. And you got to remember, this is not happening independently. The exhibit process does not happen in a bubble. We've got, the summertime is very busy. We have an entire month that's really all geared around induction, and not a lot of curatorial or exhibit work is happening because we're very focused on putting on this incredible event, the induction ceremony. There's other things that are going on. As a curator, I'm doing other things besides just creating exhibits, and the rest of it doesn't happen just by me. With a very large team effort. So everybody has a lot of things going on. So it doesn't happen all by itself. It's hard to, there's a lot of interaction.
So you've gotten the approval, the go-ahead to do the exhibit. First step, you all get together and talk, basically? Is that what happens?
Yeah, well, so when we get that go-ahead, we usually do what's called a kickoff meeting, which I just can't stand the fact that we're using a football term for that meeting, but it is. It's a kickoff meeting, and we bring together the key people that we feel is important for a kickoff meeting, which is very general concepts. And I usually try to get somebody from almost every department that's going to be directly or even indirectly involved. So we want to make sure, for example, Bruce, you're in the education department. We try to get an education department person in there. Now, they're not going to be necessarily have their hand in the pie all the time during the development, but they need to know what we're doing, and they need to know the direction that we're going, so that they can develop educational content to go along with it, or our public relations staff, or our development staff, the people who are actually going to go out and try and fund this. They need to know what the concept is. It's I love having them involved with a number of early meetings, because otherwise, when we explain to them what we're doing, we'll have to start from scratch, and it's almost like, I wish you were in these meetings, then you would kind of get it. So I started saying, hey, let's invite the development people to the meeting where we start developing these concepts, and then they're ready to hit the ground running when it's time to look for funding. But yeah, so we have that kickoff meeting, and then we start doing a lot of brainstorming. And the way I think about it is the process in general, once again, I'm making a generalization here, the process happens in a number of phases, of which I can sort of think about them in seven phases once we get that go ahead. So I guess the first part, maybe it's an 8th phase. The first phase is, can you get to the go-ahead part? But after that, we do some initial development of concepts for the exhibit to a point where we have enough information to create what's called a pitch deck and do the second phase, which is to try to raise money, because we can't, it costs money to do an exhibit, and it's not an insignificant amount of money. Mm-hmm. And so we get to that point, they try to raise money, and while that's going on, and hopefully afterwards, we continue to refine the concept. So that's part 3, is continuing to refine the concepts of the exhibit. And then parts 4 through 7 we'll talk about in the next episode, but those are the nuts and bolts part of the exhibit, really getting down to the artifacts and the labels and the exact wording and all of that. The production work, which happens to an extent, not even to an extent, simultaneously, which is the design, the casework, how things are going to lay out, the traffic flow through an exhibit, all of these elements, and physically building it, and that's part 5. And part 6 is the exhibit opening, which is probably the easiest part from my standpoint. Our events people have to put that on, and that's more of a pain for them. But there's a celebration of opening it, and we bring people out for that. And then finally, there's all the post-exhibit work. Just because an exhibit opened doesn't mean we're done. It means we've finished opening the exhibit, but there's work to be done after an exhibit opens. We can talk about that.
Tom, when you're in that initial brainstorming session with all the other curators and some of the technical folks as well, is there a lot of argumentation going on? Does it get pretty heated in terms of, no, my idea is much better than yours? How does that go?
No, there's not. One of the nice things is about this is that we all get along really well, but the main thing about getting along really well, it means that you can give and take criticism very well. You understand it's nothing personal, and yeah, we're all voicing our ideas. And anybody who knows me knows that I toss out a lot of ideas that I'm not even in favor of. But I think it's a good thing to talk about, and it gets you to think about things. I love doing that, to think about, what if we did it this way? And I'm personally not in favor of that, and I often say that, but I think it's good to discuss it, because you can learn from that. Why do we not want to do it this way? There's a lot to be learned from why you don't do things, just as much as there are why you do things. But yeah, there's a lot of discussion. We throw, especially early on, you're throwing all sorts of ideas out, and in true brainstorming fashion, you don't nix things. A true brainstorming session, everything's out there. We talk about pluses and minuses and interesting ideas that come off of it. But the early phases is building this big mountain, and eventually we're going to bring the mountain down a little bit and get it refined and manageable. But at the beginning, tossing out all sorts of ideas and concepts to try to get towards what the exhibit's going to be.
One of my favorite exhibits here at the Hall of Fame, I think it was created, I want to say 2017. I might be off by a year, but it's the Whole New Ballgame exhibit on the 2nd floor. It's a massive exhibit. Yeah. It covers 50 plus years of baseball history, 1970 to the current day. I absolutely love it. It's got a lot of video, but one of the early things I remember was trying to come up with a name. And I believe you had sent out to some of the staff, maybe all the staff, an email requesting possible names. And I came up with 6 or 7, all of which were summarily rejected, which is fine. And we settled on a Whole New Ball Game. I don't know who deserves the credit for that, but I thought that was an interesting part of the process. Just coming up with a name is a key part of it as well.
It is. And, it's not as simple as just saying, hey, what do you think should be the name to staff members, because it really helps that the name comes from the people who have been working on it for a year and a half by that point, or however long it is, because they really understand what it's all about, and they can understand. If you just say, listen, this exhibit is about baseball from 1970 to today, and that's all you said, then you might come up with a bunch of titles that really aren't what the exhibit is truly about. That's been where the thesis points and the various themes come about, and so we wanted to talk the whole new ball game. We wanted the word new in there, We wanted to make sure people understood that we're talking about lots of changes. And as you go through the exhibit, you'll see there's many different sections that talk about change occurring. Now, if you just looked at the museum list of exhibits, you might not know that that is a theme, a topic that we were going to cover in that exhibit. It's not necessarily an obvious idea from the get-go. When we first put the exhibit, pitched the idea for the exhibit, we weren't thinking, oh, this is going to be an exhibit about change. We just had a time frame. We're going to hit 1970 on till today. But then as we started developing it, we realized, you know, what's coming up over and over as we're doing these discussions is change. And that's when we started thinking like, okay, we got to embrace that. That's got to be a real important part of this exhibit. And that's all part of this early development.
Now, you mentioned before, phase 2, raising money, and that goes on concurrently as you're continuing with the development of concepts and then refining those concepts. I know that you don't go door to door asking for money. That is not your job, but that is the job of other people here at the Hall of Fame. So I know you don't do that on a day-to-day basis, but you keep in touch with the people that do. And,
Right.
and I guess people are curious about, you know, what is that process like? Getting money? Or are people generally receptive to give money for exhibits? Can you give us some insight there?
I can give you a little bit, but really it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have an Ask an Expert with our head of development. But a guy named Ken Myford, who's a fantastic guy, and he's a great baseball fan, but he's also really good at his job. And we involve him, like I said, early on in the process, so he really gets it, and he has great comments as well. So what I can tell you is we develop the concept to a certain point at which point we have a good feel for the space. We have a good feel for the what kind of storyline we're going to have and the general topics we're going to cover. We have a good feel for a couple of, now I'm going to go basketball on you, a couple of slam dunk artifacts, ones that we know are going to make the cut. They're clearly going to make this exhibit. So we can show those off. And we put together what's called, and very importantly, we have a good feel for the timing and the cost of the exhibit, a good estimate for that. And what we do is we create what's called a pitch deck, which is something that talks about all of these things, but mostly talks about what we're trying to do is we want potential donors to be as excited about an exhibit as we are. And so we try and get them excited. And it's not easy. It's easy for me to get excited. I love this, but sometimes you have more of a challenge getting other people excited. And this is an important exhibit. This is what it's going to take to do it. Would you like to be involved? And Ken and his team work very tirelessly at that and have had an incredible track record. And you know, donations come in from institutions, organizations, philanthropic individuals, all the way to just an average fan or a fan of the Hall of Fame or a fan of baseball history. And sometimes the dollar signs are very large and sometimes it's $5, $10, $50. And every little bit helps because these exhibits, you know, a major exhibit can easily work its way into 7 figures. So it takes a lot of time, a lot of staff, and a lot of money. But we hand that over when you get a sort of, it's an art form. You get a feel for when it's right to start to veer off for a second and say, you know what, we've got enough to put together a reasonable pitch deck so that Ken can do that work. And then we'll continue developing to an extent, and he'll keep us posted on how things are going. And hopefully the answer is, yep, we can do this. We're going to have the funding to do it. And then we go like gangbusters to continue on our schedule.
Who are the kinds of people that Ken and his staff typically approach? Is it Major League Baseball? Is it team owners, former players, Hall of Famers? Who is it? That's a great question for Ken, because he has a great view of understanding, you know, that world better than I do. So I let him do his work and just keep my fingers crossed. Yeah, and I think an important thing to emphasize here, and sometimes people will come up to me and they discover that I work at the Hall of Fame, and they'll say something like, "Oh, you're at the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame," and I'll try to politely explain it's actually not called that. We're not, owned or operated. We don't have an official connection to Major League Baseball. We are run independently. So our exhibits are not funded by Major League Baseball. That, I think, is an important point to make.
Yeah, and we're independent. We're totally independent of Major League Baseball. The exhibits are not necessarily about Major League Baseball. Our exhibit called Diamond Dreams, about women in baseball, has some Major League components to it, but that story is very much not Major League Baseball centric. Our exhibit called One for the Books, about baseball records, has probably 90 to 95% of it are Major League records, but there's other records from other levels or types of baseball, whether it's Little League Baseball or the All-American Girls League or baseball in Japan. That's just to name a few. So we're not only focused on Major League Baseball. Now, certain exhibits are, but yeah, we're trying to cover the entire story of baseball. So we're the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. One trivia question I often get people is, where's the Baseball Hall of Fame? And they usually say Cooperstown. I say, no, the Baseball Hall of Fame is in Tokyo, Japan. That's the name of their institution, is Baseball Hall of Fame. We are the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. That's a trick question.
You would have gotten me with that one, definitely.
Well, now you know.
Yeah, interesting. You look at the situation in terms of putting together an exhibit, and whoever decides to give you money, they don't then tell you, well, this is how I want the exhibit to be done, right? This is something the curators do on their own.
Right, we want them to come along with us. So we'll say, hey, this is the direction we're going. Would you like to help out?
Yeah.
We have a great team that comes up with ideas, or more importantly, that can develop ideas, right? Sometimes the ideas come from outside. That's great. But our team of curators and the exhibits and design department as well, we all work very closely together. And then our research department pitches in, our PR department pitches in. We talked about it before, Bruce. You pitched in with your expertise on baseball cards, so we had you involved in the baseball cards exhibit. From an expertise standpoint, in general, not always, but in general, we're good to go. But I'll tell you, a big part of the exhibit process, and that has to be done early on, is assessing our expertise. And some of the expertise we've got, some of that we have to bone up on, but other ones we go, you know what, we need to go out and get some outside help. So for our exhibit on Latino baseball, called Viva Baseball, we had a very prestigious group of, I want to say it was probably 6 or 7 guys who were very knowledgeable about the topic, and they could get us up to speed much faster than doing it on our own, which we could have done, but it would have taken a lot longer and really probably would have suffered. So we go out for experts at different levels. That was a pretty significant level. For One for the Books, I had a core group of people, maybe 3 or 4 outside the museum, that I was asking questions to for the history of baseball records and some statistics related histories. But some of what we do completely internally. But that's a big part of it, is assessing the tools at hand. And so, like I said, who are the people that are going to work on it? That's the form of a tool. Do we have the right artifacts to tell the story? Now, early on, we're not going to get down to the nitty gritty, but we can do a general assessment of it. And I'll give you an example for that. A number of years ago, we did an exhibit about baseball in the Olympics. And very early in the process, as I was doing a lot of research about baseball in the Olympics, it became clear to me that the approach that we were going to take was we wanted to cover every Olympics in which baseball was played. And that goes back to 1912. A lot of people don't realize that, but it goes back that's over 100 years ago. Even at that time, it was over 100 years ago. And in assessing quickly assessing what was in our collection, I realized, you know what, we're going to have to go outside for a lot of a lot of artifacts, we're going to have to do a decent number of loans. So I think we had about 50 artifacts in the exhibit, and about half of them were loans. That does not happen very often. Our collection is fantastic. So the tool set in terms of our collection is fantastic, but we have to assess it each time and determine what are we missing. Is there going to be a problem where we need to augment that tool set? So those are the kind of things that we're thinking about. Once again, early on, you don't want to be doing that, late in the process and suddenly realize, oh, we have a problem here, because that can inform the way you design the exhibit, the way you come up with themes. That's an important part.
In addition to finding artifacts, you also have to ask yourself a very basic question. Who is the audience for the exhibit? And people might be tempted to say, well, baseball fans, right? And in a general sense, that is accurate. But you're also looking at age groups. You're talking about different kinds of reading levels, different understandings of baseball, casual fan versus the diehard crazies like we are. So how do you adjust? How do you figure out who exactly is the audience for this particular exhibit?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's actually a number of different things that we think about when we're doing this early development of exhibit. And I guess I want to take a step back and actually just use an analogy to give you a feel for why we have to ask that question and so many other questions. And that is, when you're making an exhibit, it's almost like, if you're doing an interpretive storytelling exhibit, it's almost like building a home. You've got to plan it out carefully. If you just start building without a plan, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to have walls that don't meet up, and you're going to have stairs that go nowhere and floors that aren't level. And you just can't start pounding away wood and nails. You have to do a lot of planning and asking yourself questions. You're drafting and redrafting, but what kind of house do I want to build, and who's going to live in the house? I'm going to build one kind of house for a small family. I'm going to do another house for a couple who are in their 80s. What rooms do I need, and where are those rooms going to be? I think the kitchen better be near the dining room. You have to think about that when you're building a house. It's not really any different for building an exhibit. So you have to ask these questions, like the one you brought up. Who's our audience? That's going to inform how I come up with the concept for the exhibit and how we put it together. So specifically, it may change depending on the exhibit. So we're always thinking about, hey, we know our visitorship is a wide range of ages. We know sometimes people are coming in with smaller children, and sometimes they're not. And as you mentioned, very importantly, some people are big baseball fans, hardcore. They know a lot. Maybe some of them are just regular baseball fans and not really interested in the history, so they know a certain level. And then you have people who are hangers-on who maybe aren't really that jazzed that they're coming around through the museum. We want to make sure that they get something out of these exhibits as well. And hopefully we've turned them around a little bit and they think, you know what, this baseball history thing isn't so bad. This is kind of fun to read about. So we have to think, as we're developing the exhibit, can we engage, which is a big part of what we think about is engagement. Can we engage with all sorts of different audiences? However, I'll give you a specific example of how we thought of an audience very differently for a particular exhibit. And that was for the whole new ballgame exhibit that you were talking about, the one about baseball from the last 50 years or so. Because when people are going through the museum and they maybe start off on the second floor and they see our exhibit about baseball prior to 1900, we're not talking to anybody coming in the museum who experienced that. Nobody walking through the museum saw 1 second of baseball in the 19th century or earlier. They may have heard about it because they've read some books, or they've seen a movie, or their uncle would tell them something that he had heard once, whatever. And certainly they know about it from maybe certain Hall of Famers who are big names, whether it's a Cy Young or Mike Kelly or whoever it may be. So we have to talk to that audience differently than the audience in Whole New Ballgame, because we realized very early on, you know what, that audience that's coming into Whole New Ballgame, a ton of these people either were at a ball game when a certain event happened, or they grew up during this era and they understand the concepts we're talking about, the changes that occurred in this era, or they watched it on TV, or they've seen it on YouTube videos a million times. They're very familiar with it. So we would want to engage with them in a different way because they have different information they're coming to the table with. And so we did. We embraced that. As you know, we have 4 very large video screens where you can sort of scroll through and choose important moments from the era. And we wanted to use this because we thought, you know what, these people have seen this before, or they know about it, and they'll want to relive it probably the way they've seen it before with videos they've seen or they're familiar with, and sometimes some videos they're not familiar with.
Yeah.
But that's an example of knowing your audience and understanding what information they're coming with and their mindset coming to an exhibit.
And I want to talk about technology in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
But before we do that, in terms of what you present as far as the text on the exhibit labels, and you made this point when we were talking about this off air a few days ago, that people don't come here looking to read a book. They want, a certain amount of text and information. They also want a visual presentation. Maybe they want something interactive, depending on what the exhibit theme might be.
Right.
So you can't just splatter thousands of words up there and expect people to digest that.
Right. So as we started off, we were talking about different forms of storytelling. If it turns out that as I'm moving forward with something, I realize I can only tell this with 500 words or 10,000 words, then I have to say to myself, you know what, maybe I should be writing a book and not making an exhibit. Maybe that's the better way to convey a story. When you want to tell a story, you should think about what's the best way to convey it. And we've had people approach us with ideas and for exhibits, and there have been times when I've said, you know what, that would make a really good book, but it won't work so much as an exhibit. And I try to explain why. I do it very nicely. I don't want to crush anybody, but sometimes there are things that work better as books, or better as a movie, or better as whatever the case may be. So we have to figure out what is the best way to tell these stories. But yes, people do not want to come here and have to sit for a long time and read. That's what's great about a book. Or they don't want to just sit in front of a video screen for a long, long time. That might be better as a documentary or a movie. So we have to kind of hit just the right way of telling a story. And you brought up technology. We're not going to use technology just to be whiz bang. We're going to use technology if that is the best way to help convey a story. If there's a better way to do it and it's actually low tech, great. As a matter of fact, if it's all things being equal, we might want to err on the side of low tech because, believe me, it's a lot less expensive. A big part of price tag can be these very expensive computer interactives, which we don't have the staff to put together, so we have to go to an outside contractor, and that takes up a lot of time and babysitting of that process. That's a whole big process we can talk about probably in the next episode. But yeah, you do it the way that it's going to work best to tell the story, because that's the key. How are we telling the story? Are we sticking to the thesis points? And I think we didn't really talk so much about that, but we usually try and craft maybe 2 thesis points. We write out very nicely. We work really hard on these thesis points, and make a nice sentence out of them that the visitors never see, but hopefully they get. And every label I write, every artifact I choose, every story we decide to go with, every design element, every little part better be working towards hammering away at one of those 2, maybe if it's a big exhibit, 3 thesis points. If it's not, we're not on target. And as I mentioned to you before, I've mentioned to a lot of people, anybody who knows me knows that I can go off on a tangent like nobody. I mean, I'm very good at that, but we don't have time to go off on tangents in an exhibit. We got to make sure we're staying on topic and hitting away at one of the points that we want people to come away with.
Let me go back to technology for just a moment. You mentioned Whole New Ball Game and all those great video screens. They're huge screens replaying all these wonderful moments. Shoebox Treasures has a very distinctive technology in that people can actually go in and essentially create their own baseball card through their phone or their home computer. They can actually print it out at a later time. So those are 2 very distinct ways that technology has been used for our 2 most recent exhibits. But you didn't go in saying we've got to use technology, it has to fit.
No. All we got to do is make sure we tell a really good story and engage our audience. And there's lots of ways to do it. And sometimes the best way is through an interactive. That is true. But sometimes that's not the way. But I'm very story driven. Now, having said that, sometimes there's artifacts that are just so great, we know we're going to get this artifact in here. And usually the reason they're so great is there's a great story there. It's something just that's really neat to talk about. So it's not like, oh my gosh, we have to shoehorn a story around this great artifact.
Yeah.
It's great because there's something to talk about there. So
with Whole New Ball Game, what were the one or two main thesis points that you wanted to create? I mean, I know what they are, but I want the audience that hasn't seen the exhibit to know what are the two big themes or three big themes that you're hoping most people will grasp when they go through that exhibit?
Well, let me switch up on you a little bit, and let's do one for the books. I think one for the books might actually work better to help people explain it. That's a very large exhibit as well. It's not as big as Whole New Ball Game is the biggest, just in terms of physical space. But one for the books is really quite large as well. And basically, we culled it down to three main thesis points, of which one is takes priority over the other two. So there's three of them. I'll give them in random order, essentially. First of all, one of them was that baseball records, which are not statistics, I'm paraphrasing it. Believe me, it's much cleaner what we wrote down. But baseball records, which is the final culmination of statistics when you really think about it, reflect the pinnacles of achievement in the game. We wanted to make sure people understood that records reflect the pinnacle of achievement. The second thing we wanted to make sure people came away with, if at all possible, is some records, even records that have been broken, have almost reached a sacred status. An example would be the 56-game hitting streak of Joe DiMaggio. Hasn't been broken in Major League Baseball. But another one is Hank Aaron's record of 714 home runs that, Babe Ruth's record of 714 home runs, which has been broken twice, but 714 still has this aura about it.
Sure.
And there's lots of these. There's a number of these. But the most important one that I don't think is necessarily obvious to people, those are a little bit more obvious, is records give the illusion that you can compare players and teams from different eras. But actually, records often highlight how much the game has changed and why such comparisons are really not meaningful. And the easiest way to explain that real quickly, now I'm going to get some hardcore baseball, is when Roger Maris was chasing Babe Ruth in 1961, Babe Ruth's record was 60 home runs in a single season, and Maris eventually got 61. He did that over a 162-game season. Babe Ruth had a 154-game season in which to pile up as many home runs as he could. And so at the time, the commissioner of baseball said, if Maris doesn't get his 61st home run in the first 154 games that the Yankees play, then we need to do something to make sure people understand that it was a little bit of an apples and oranges situation.
Yeah.
So that was a very controversial ruling, but that was the idea. And what he wanted to do is, he said, there should be context here. You should have context behind this record, because if you just read it without any context, you lose the story of what Babe Ruth did, and because he is no longer in the record book. Well, what I tried to do in this exhibit was say, you know what? It's all context. It's not just that one record. Every record has a little asterisk behind it. So if you look in a record book and you see the who, what, when, and where, you miss the most important part, which is the how and the why.
Right.
And that's the context. Now, that's not necessarily an obvious thing that you come up with when you're saying, hey, we got to do an exhibit about baseball records. But after a lot of brainstorming, we thought, you know what, this is a very rich, engaging story that we can tell throughout the exhibit. And hopefully people will come away going, yeah, you know what, it isn't quite as simple as just this is the record for most triples in a single season. There's something behind that makes you go, oh, that's interesting. I get it now. So hopefully that gives you a feel for the kind of thesis points we're putting together.
It's interesting, in the 162 versus 154 game comparison doesn't just involve home runs. It involves RBIs, most stolen bases in a season,
Sure.
most pitching victories, most saves. All these things are affected. by the fact that in the early 1960s, baseball tacked on 8 games to the major league schedule.
Right.
And it's, of course, this year we have, maybe the biggest asterisk ever. Won't actually be in the record books probably, but
Who knows?
spiritually there will be an asterisk because of a 60-game season.
Right. So it's going to be very helpful to understand what was going on in the 2020 season, and not just blindly think it's another season. And another thing about the Babe Ruth Roger Maris situation is that when the decision was made, they said, oh, well, we maybe need to give context to Roger Maris's record because he had 8 extra games. Well, wait a second. Nobody said that about Babe Ruth in 1927 when he hit 60 home runs. And, or let me rephrase that. Nobody said that about Babe Ruth in 1920 when he set the record for most home runs in a single season, breaking a record that happened in 1884 by Ned Williamson, who had way fewer games in which to do it. So, it's asterisks all the way down, right? So that's why hopefully people come away with it going, okay, every record has a story behind it. And some of the stories are more interesting than others, but there's more to it than just a number and a year and a person.
So those some of the themes that hopefully folks will grasp. They may not understand or get all 3 at once, but if they can pick up 1 or 2, then I think you've pretty much done your job as a curator.
If they get 1, I'm happy.
Yeah, we want to take questions for Tom Schieber. You can do that in the Zoom group chat. If you go either to the top or bottom of your screen, there's that menu bar. On the far right, you'll see the word More in 3 dots. Click on that. A scroll down bar will then appear. You can go then on chat from there. It does say Zoom group chat at the top of the box. We have a couple of questions already, Tom. Let's go to the first one is from Kevin Phillips. How many exhibits are you currently working on now? I think we may have answered. He posted this question earlier. He did ask about how far in advance are you projecting, and you talked about a 10, 20-year plan. So let's try to tackle, Tom, that first part of the question. How many exhibits are the curators working on at this moment? Don't have to tell us what they are, but how many are you working with?
Yeah, so there's, as you had mentioned at the beginning, we have a couple exhibits that are just about to open, so we're very close on those. Much of basically the heavy curatorial part is basically done. There's curators always involved to the very end, but the heavy part has been done much earlier. This is the real crunch time for our exhibits and design team, building and doing layout and creating mounts, et cetera, lots to do. And so we have the exhibit about Field of Dreams. We have an exhibit coming up about about fantasy baseball, and that's going to be coming up very soon. Then there's other exhibits that are much early, they're way early in the process. So we haven't, the process before step 1, it's where it's on the docket, and so we know we're going to do it, but we haven't got the official go ahead. We haven't had our kickoff meeting. So they're all at different stages. But so working on the work that's done on one is very different level and type at another. But with the things we have in the hopper somewhere, we're looking at anywhere from 8 to 10 exhibits that we know are out there somewhere. Some of them are almost done. Some of them are further away.
Question from Jeremy Levine. What are the oldest exhibits currently at the Baseball Hall of Fame?
That's a great question. So the oldest exhibit is basically, how do I want to phrase this? So I think so for example, the art gallery has gone through many incarnations. So I'm thinking of that as more modern because the way it's set up right now, I'm going to call that a more modern exhibit. But the one that's really, so we're always updating exhibits. So, which exhibit had the ribbon cutting the longest ago? That kind of it's tough because we're always trying to keep up with exhibits even after it's opened. But the timeline from around 1900 to the beginning of Whole New Ballgame, while we've been constantly updating that, in essence, it still retains its very 1980s-ness. So I'd say that's in most reasonable ways of thinking about that question. That's the oldest.
Yeah.
But but once again, we do keep up with it. We're trying to add new things, but yeah.
The only part of the Hall of Fame that I can think of that's older, it's not an exhibit, is the Plaque Gallery, which was built in 1958. That actually doesn't change very much in terms of its overall look. What changes are the new plaques for the new inductees each year. But
Right.
again, that is not an exhibit. I guess that's more of a display, if we're going to use the terminology.
Bruce, you nailed it. That's right. That's right. So there's not a storyline there, and that's a great example of when I talk about display. I'm not saying a display is a bad thing. I think the Plaque Gallery is fantastic, and then you talk to most people coming to the museum, and they love it. But it's good for what it's doing, and it's not really a storytelling device. Even the plaques themselves are not giving you a complete bio or even incomplete bio of the individuals who are Hall of Famers. It's giving you interesting highlights and sort of talking about this is why this guy is a Hall of Famer. But we're not professing that this is a complete bio of each individual. That's not its purpose. So yeah, great call. That's the way I think about it. And by the way, I want to correct myself earlier. Babe Ruth broke Ned Williamson's record in 1919. Not 1920. 1920, he broke his old record by a ton by 1919. Just want to get the facts right.
One other exhibit I'm wondering about is baseball at the movies. I know that's been around a long time. I don't know if it goes that far back to the 80s.
You know, off the top of my head, I think it does not go that far back, but I don't recall exactly when it started. But we did a major overhaul of that exhibit. I would not say it's a new exhibit, but we really did took everything off exhibit, took all the movie posters off exhibit, and it essentially started from scratch, but we used the same space and the same case layout and the same design.
Yeah.
But otherwise, so I call that a recuration.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that, but with the Babe Ruth exhibit, it was in basically the same footprint where the old Babe Ruth exhibit was, but that's a brand new exhibit. Yeah. Topic is the same, Babe Ruth, but we treated it very differently. The number of artifacts, we talked about this already in our earlier Zoom virtual talk. So it's very different.
Question from Steve Sankner. I hope I pronounced that okay, Steve. I've always enjoyed the no-hitter gallery, which had the chronological history of no-hitters pitched, the autographed ball, and the photo of the pitcher who achieved the feat. Is this still on display in the museum?
The answer is no, it's not on display. It came down, and we do get a number of questions about this, and I can explain that. So first of all, we did want to we wanted the records room to be an interpretive exhibit. That did not really tell much of a story. It was a neat display of a lot of baseballs, but it wasn't helping us with the thesis points that we wanted to do. Secondly, it took up we had a baseball representing every no-hitter since the museum opened. Now, a lot of people don't realize that that's what that was, but it was. So it starts from 1939, I'm sorry, from 1936, and then it moved up. But that took up a lot of real estate, and we thought, you know what? Do we need to take up this real estate, or could we use this to tell other stories? And the answer is the number of stories that we could fit in there was tremendous. I mean, that was a very large display.
Yeah.
So no, but we do have artifacts from many no-hitters on exhibit. We list every no-hitter on a flip book where you can see everyone, so you can still see all of them going all the way back to 1871. So everything's included, more so than actually the old wall of baseballs. Not an easy decision because we knew people liked it, but everybody came down and decided, yeah, we could do so much more here. So let's do that.
In particular, I love the Nolan Ryan display within the exhibit, the 7 caps from each of his no-hitters.
How cool is that?
I love that. Yeah. The way that's arranged, and of course the fact that he donated a cap from each of the games, pretty significant as well. We'll take one more question, Tom. It is from Dale Rhines. How long have you had the lockers of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig? The Ruth locker is in the Babe Ruth room. And the Gehrig locker is part of the timeline of the 1930s. Do you know, Tom, how long we've had those lockers?
I can't recall the year that they were donated to the Hall of Fame, but I can tell you that they both came at the same time. There's a presentation at Yankee Stadium. So where they were presented to the Hall of Fame, and we brought them back to Cooperstown. It was pretty neat. You know, after Lou Gehrig retired, they kept his locker in the locker room, and it stayed there until it was donated to the Hall of Fame. And the same thing after Babe Ruth retired. Actually, let me rephrase that. After Babe Ruth left the Yankees, he had not really retired. He still was playing. But after he left the Yankees, they kept his locker as well. Nobody else used that locker. And they kept it well after he passed away. As a matter of fact, when he had his retired number event at Yankee Stadium in 1948, he dressed in front of his old locker. Yeah. And there you can see photos of that. And then after he passed away, a number of years later, both the Gehrig and the Ruth lockers were donated to us at the same time.
And lockers are always great visually. They always are very striking presences in those two exhibits. Tom, we want to thank you for your terrific insights over the last hour. We hope you've enjoyed Ask the Expert Creating an Exhibit. Tom, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
All right. We do appreciate Tom's time. And on Thursday, we're going to head back to the curatorial team. We will draw from the experience of Gabrielle Augustine. She is the lead curator on the temporary exhibit, Is This Heaven?, which is actually opening up this week here in Cooperstown. It's a temporary exhibit featuring artifacts from the film, from the Field of Dreams, site itself. We're excited to be talking about that. And that is coming up 2 days from now. So that's Thursday, August the 13th. It'll be a little bit earlier than our program today with Tom. That'll be 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Make sure to visit our website, baseballhall.org, to find out about registration. It's a free program like all of these are, but you do need to register. We thank Tom. We thank all the listeners and viewers for being with us today for Ask the Expert. Have a great day, everybody.